He thought he'd locked his heart away forever, until the day the widowed millionaire stepped into his garden and saw his nanny bathing his twins in a wooden barrel, their laughter echoing like ghosts of a past he swore he'd buried. What happened next would change all of their lives. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The rain had stopped just before Grace Moreno stepped out of the cab, but the air was still heavy with the scent of wet earth. The Ashford estate loomed ahead, its towering gates slowly swinging open with the low groan of iron. She gripped the strap of her worn leather bag tighter, her heart pounding with the weight of the unknown. At 28, Grace had grown used to surviving on resilience, not comfort. This interview was a gamble, a last chance before the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter became impossible to ignore. The drive stretched longer than she expected, lined with ancient oaks, whose branches reached over the path like arms intent on keeping strangers out. When the mansion finally came into view, its gray stone walls and tall windows gave off an air of both grandeur and loneliness. It wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. The butler, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a face carved with deep lines, greeted her at the front door. Moreno? His voice was polite but carried a tone of quiet scrutiny. She said, forcing a smile. Mr. Ashford is expecting you in the study. Before we go in, I should tell you. He hesitated, glancing toward the staircase. The twins are good children, but they've been through a great deal. They tend to attach quickly. Mr. Ashford doesn't encourage it. He prefers things to remain professional. Grace's brows knitted. Professional, she echoed softly, not sure if she was being warned or tested. The butler's eyes flicked briefly upward, where two small faces were peeking through the banister. A boy and a girl, identical in their tousled brown hair and wide, curious eyes. They ducked back as soon as Grace's gaze met theirs. It had 5 nannies in the last 7 months, the butler added, his voice dropping lower. None lasted more than 4 weeks. Grace straightened her shoulders. Maybe it's time that changed. He gave no response, only gestured for her to follow him through the long, dim hallway. The walls were lined with family portraits, all impeccably framed. In many, a striking woman with golden hair smiled alongside a younger Nicholas Ashford, their joy vivid even in stillness. The absence of her presence in the most recent photographs made the air in the hallway feel heavier. The study door was slightly ajar. The butler knocked once before opening it, ushering her inside. Nicholas Ashford sat behind a mahogany desk, his gaze fixed on a folder in front of him. At 36, he had the kind of presence that commanded attention without a word, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with dark hair that was just beginning to show the faintest touch of gray at the temples. When he looked up, his eyes sharp and a shade between steel and storm, assessed her in a single sweep. Moreno, he said, his tone clipped. You've had experience with children? She replied evenly. I've worked with several families. My most recent position was caring for 3 siblings under the age of 8. Why did you leave? Family moved overseas, she said simply, though she could feel the weight of his skepticism. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Children in this house require discipline and routine. We don't indulge whims. There are schedules for meals, lessons, and bedtime. No deviations. Grace met his gaze without flinching. I believe in structure, Mr. Ashford, but I also believe children need warmth. His jaw tightened at the word, as though it was something sharp against his skin. Warmth is not a replacement for stability. Neither is stability a replacement for love, she replied before she could stop herself. A silence settled over the room, taut as a pulled string. He didn't look away, but there was a flicker, barely perceptible in his eyes. From the corner of her vision, Grace caught the faint movement of the twins, peeking again from behind the doorway. This time they lingered longer, their curiosity stronger than their shyness. Nicholas' voice broke the quiet. The position requires discretion. No photographs, no personal visits without approval, No crossing boundaries. If you take this job, you follow my rules. Grace's mind flashed to the envelopes piling up in her apartment, the tightness in her chest every time her phone buzzed with an overdue notice. She nodded. Understood. He studied her for another long moment before saying, "You'll start on a trial basis. 1 week, we'll see how you manage." As they rose, Grace glanced through the doorway and caught the twins retreating up the stairs. Something about the way they moved, quick but not careless, told her they were used to staying out of sight. On the way to her assigned room, she passed a set of double doors slightly ajar. The butler, noticing her glance, paused. "The playroom," he explained quietly, "hasn't been used in 2 years." Inside, Grace saw dust-covered shelves of untouched toys, a rocking horse in the corner, and sunlight fighting its way through closed curtains. She turned her head toward the garden beyond the hall windows. It was beautiful but unkempt, the once vibrant flowers overtaken by weeds. It was the kind of place children should have been running through, but it, too, seemed forgotten. Grace didn't need the butler to tell her the truth. This house wasn't just full of rules, it was full of grief. Still, as she set her bag down in her room, she knew she would take the job. She had faced worse storms than Nicholas Ashford's coldness, and for reasons she couldn't quite name, she already felt a pull toward the twins she'd barely met. Maybe it was the way their eyes had followed her, or the hint of longing in their half-grim smiles. Whatever it was, Grace decided then, she wasn't here to simply survive the Ashford estate. She was here to change it. And she was ready for whatever it took. Grace unpacked her few belongings with deliberate slowness, using the quiet moment to steady herself. The room was larger than her entire apartment, its tall windows draped in heavy velvet curtains that dulled the afternoon light. A 4-poster bed stood at the center, its crisp white sheets tucked with military precision. Everything in the Ashford estate seemed meticulously arranged, as if disorder itself was an unwelcome intruder. A soft knock broke the silence. When Grace opened the door, the twins stood there, shoulder to shoulder, as if they had rehearsed their entrance. Evan's expression was guarded, while Ella's eyes held a spark of curiosity that she tried to hide behind a small frown. "Hello," Grace said gently, crouching down to their level. "I'm Grace." The children exchanged a quick glance before Evan asked, "Are you staying?" "Ow," she replied, offering a smile, "if you want me to." Ella tilted her head. "The others didn't stay." Grace's chest tightened. "Well, maybe we can give each other a chance." She didn't press for more. She could feel how fragile this moment was. Before either twin could answer, the butler's voice floated from down the hall. "Children, it's time for your reading hour." The pair turned as one, their synchronized steps vanishing into the distance. Grace closed her door slowly, her mind turning over their words like puzzle pieces. Later that afternoon, she wandered the halls, memorizing the layout. Every room spoke of the family's past. The music room with a grand piano under a dust sheet. The dining hall with 12 high-backed chairs, though only 3 were ever used. And the walls lined with photographs from years ago, frozen smiles of a life that had changed abruptly. In the kitchen, she met Mrs. Porter, the cook, a round-faced woman with a warm but cautious manner. "You will want to keep to the schedule, dear," Mrs. Porter advised as she stirred a pot. "Mr. Ashford likes things done a certain way. Breakfast is served at 7 sharp, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Children?" Grace asked. "We followed the same routine. Lessons in the morning, supervised play after lunch, reading before bed. No exceptions." Grace nodded, though inside she was already wondering how she could bring light into such a regimented existence. Her chance came sooner than expected. That evening, she passed the library and heard muffled voices. Pushing the door open slightly, she saw Evan and Ella sitting at a long table, their tutor droning on about sums and spelling. Evan's head was drooping, his pencil tapping in a rhythm of boredom. Ella stared out the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. When the tutor stepped out to retrieve a book, Grace slipped inside. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. They looked at her warily. "We're doing work," Evan said flatly. "I can help," she offered, pulling a chair beside them, "but only if we make it a game." Their interest flickered despite themselves. Within minutes, she had turned their math problems into a scavenger hunt across the bookshelves, each correct answer unlocking the next clue. By the time the tutor returned, both children were laughing, an unfamiliar sound in the echoing library. That night, as she lay in bed, Grace thought about the unused playroom and the overgrown garden. She pictured Evan's guarded eyes softening with curiosity, Ella's frown breaking into a smile. There was life in them yet, and she intended to draw it out. The next morning, she was summoned to the study. Nicholas sat at his desk, reading something with that same intent focus that seemed to shield him from the world. "I've received word from the tutor," he said without looking up. "The children were lively yesterday?" Grace kept her tone neutral. "They participated. That's progress." He looked up then, his gaze sharp. "I don't hire nannies to alter my children's routine." "I don't take jobs to watch children wilt," she replied before she could stop herself. The air between them tightened, but Nicholas didn't rebuke her. Instead, he leaned back slowly. "You're here for a trial, Ms. Moreno. Keep that in mind." Grace inclined her head, but as she left the room, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just annoyance, but maybe curiosity. By afternoon, she had settled into the rhythm of the house. She accompanied the twins to their lessons, joined them for their short, supervised play in the drawing room, and listened quietly as they read aloud before bed. Every moment was wrapped in rules, yet she sensed the cracks in the structure. She saw it in the way Evan lingered when she praised him, in the way Ella's hand sought hers for just a moment before letting go. As she closed her door that night, Grace thought of the butler's warning, "No one lasted here," but she also thought of the dust-covered playroom and the neglected garden. Those weren't just signs of a house frozen in grief, they were invitations waiting for someone brave enough to answer. And Grace Moreno had never been afraid of the dark. The binder arrived at breakfast, a thick sheaf of laminated pages clipped with black tabs that looked more like a legal contract than a guide to caring for two 5-year-olds. The butler set it beside Grace's plate with a respectful nod, then resumed pouring tea as if nothing about it were unusual. Evan and Ella ate in silence, napkins folded into perfect squares on their laps, eyes flicking from the binder to Grace and back again. "Household protocol," Grace read on the cover, her thumb rubbing the glossy edge. Inside, the rules marched in orderly lines. No bedtime stories, screens allowed only for educational content and only on Wednesdays. Outdoor play by advance written approval. Hugs permitted only to soothe injury or distress. No caregiver may sleep in the twins' room. All deviations to be reported. She lifted her gaze and found the twins waiting, faces. "Do we pass or fail?" Evan asked, so softly she almost missed it. "It's not a test," Grace answered, gentling her tone. "It's a set of reminders." She tapped the page, then slid the binder to the side. "And I'm very good at remembering the important parts." Ella's mouth curved, quick and secret. "Like what?" "Like how you both take your juice after the first bite of toast," Grace said. "And how you don't like the crust if it's too brown. And how Evan counts the blueberries before he eats them." He froze, then hid a smile in his cup. Mrs. Porter, from the stove, gave Grace a look that said, "Careful." The room had the hush of a church. Even clinking cutlery seemed too loud. After breakfast, the staff moved like clock gears, precise, polished, distant. The housekeeper checked the children's shoes and hair bows with gentle hands and an averted gaze. The driver stood in the doorway, already arranging tomorrow's route. Even kindness here wore gloves. No one knelt to the twins' height, no one told a silly joke. The air felt lined with velvet, muffling all the bright edges. Lessons began at 9. Grace sat in the study's back corner, taking notes and absorbing minutes. The tutor's voice was pleasant and exact. Evan and Ella answered correctly and without sparkle. When Ella slipped and said 13 instead of 12, she corrected herself mid-breath and flushed as if someone had shouted. No one had. The room simply absorbed her mistake and went on. During the first break, Evan drifted toward Grace's chair, pretending to examine the brass globe by her knee. "Do you like rules?" he asked the equator. "Like some of them," Grace said. "The ones that keep people safe, and the ones that help us take turns." "What about the ones that make your stomach feel tight?" Ella chimed from the rug, coloring within the lines so carefully her fingers looked tense. "Those might not be the right size," Grace said. "Sometimes rules fit like shoes. You grow and they pinch." Ella considered this, then colored one flower petal far outside the lines, eyes flicking up to see if lightning would strike. Nothing did. Grace winked. The petals stayed. At noon, lunch arrived with military punctuality. The twins sat straight as arrows, while Mrs. Porter presented carrot soup and buttered bread. Grace asked if they would like to help sprinkle herbs the next day. Mrs. Porter raised an eyebrow, then nodded once. "A pinch," she said, "not a..." The afternoon's recreation was a narrow window labeled in the binder as "supervised, indoor." The playroom down the hall remained closed. No authorization had come. Instead, Grace spread a roll of butcher paper on the kitchen table and set out a box of crayons. "We'll draw something that doesn't have lines," she said. "Only ideas." Evan glanced at the clock. "Are we allowed?" "We're at the table," Grace replied. "And the table is for making and eating." She kept her voice casual, her hands steady. Small defiance was a door you opened without squeaking. The first marks were cautious. Then Ella made a sun with hair, and Evan drew a castle with too many windows, and Grace added a tiny ladder no one asked for but everyone liked. When a blue crayon toppled and rolled, she let it fall. It left a comet trail across the butcher paper. The children stared like they'd witnessed a miracle. They were still coloring when footsteps tapped in the hall. Nicholas paused in the doorway, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. He took in the paper, the box of crayons, the soft hum of the children at work. "Creation was scheduled for the drawing room," he said. Grace didn't startle. "We're drawing," she answered. The room cooperated. His gaze slid to the twins. Ella's crayon froze mid-stroke. Evan's hand hovered. Nicholas studied the comet trail, the hair on the sun, the ladder leaning against nothing. For a heartbeat, something eased in his face. Then it was gone. "Carry on," he said, and moved away. Grace exhaled after he passed, quietly enough that only the butcher paper felt it. Ella's shoulders dropped a fraction. Evan resumed the windows. In the late afternoon, the binder's spine stared at her from the counter while she measured out snack bowls. She opened it again, read the line about hugs only to soothe injury or distress, and closed it with her palm on the cover. When the twins returned from the garden window to wash hands, Ella hesitated in the doorway. "Sometimes I feel sore in hand." Grace dried her hands and knelt. "Is it a hurt we can name?" she asked. "Or a hurt that needs a hug first?" Ella's lip trembled. "Hug first." Grace wrapped her in, careful and firm, nothing showy, a shelter built with arms. Evan edged closer like a moth to lamplight. Grace held out one arm without breaking the circle. He stepped in. 3 breaths later they opened the circle and went to the sink. No lightning. The binder stayed closed. Bedtime came with its own paragraphs. No stories. Lights at 7:30. Grace turned off the lamp and sat in the hall, as the rules allowed, where the children could see her shadow. The quiet grew thick. After 5 minutes, a whisper came from Ella's room. "Do shadows count as stories?" Grace smiled at the ceiling. "They do if they move?" She lifted her hands and made a slow bird on the wall, its wings beating into existence, then morphing into a rabbit that sniffed at the baseboard, then into 2 small figures holding a kite string that stretched up and out of the frame. Ella's giggle slipped under the door like a secret. Evan's whisper floated from the other room. "Make the kite fly." She moved her fingers and let the kite tug. The shadow boy and shadow girl leaned back and laughed without sound. Grace kept the images simple, the rhythm steady, until their breathing deepened and the hall grew quiet again. The next afternoon, Nicholas's calendar showed a late meeting. Grace watched the car roll down the drive, waited 10 minutes, then found the windowed door that opened to the terrace. She had slipped a coil of twine into her pocket and a bag of clothespins under her sweater. 5 minutes, she told the twins, her voice low and bright. They stepped into a world that had been waiting for them. The garden was not feral, but neglected, wildflowers bustling through formal beds, ivy making a gentle claim on the gazebo post. Evan stopped on the threshold, as if air itself had taste. Ella reached for the nearest ray of sunlight with both hands, catching nothing and everything. Grace tied twine between two posts and clipped squares of paper to it. "Wind pictures," she explained. "Draw what the air feels like." She gave them each a pencil and, after one last look at the empty drive, she drew one too. Evan's first line wobbled like a heartbeat. Ella's looked like a road that couldn't decide which hill to climb. Grace drew a spiral and labeled it, "Breathe." "Time," she said softly when the kitchen clock chimed. They slipped back inside, cheeks pink, a bright secret stowed under their ribs. Grace tucked the wind pictures into a folder and wiped a bit of soil from Ella's knee with the gentlest corner of a napkin. They were washing hands when the front door opened. Nicholas's footsteps were crisp, the rhythms of a day that had gone as planned. He glanced into the kitchen. The twins stood on stools like sailors at a sink, sleeves rolled to elbows. Grace's sleeves were damp too. He looked for disorder and found none. His gaze paused on the folder by the fruit bowl and moved on. That evening, while the house exhaled and the last lamps were turned low, Grace returned the binder to the counter. She touched the cover with 2 fingers. "I remember the important parts," she told it quietly, and turned away. By the next morning, the binder's tabs felt like little flags planted across the day. Breakfast at 7, lessons at 9, piano at 2. Grace moved inside the schedule the way a sailor moves inside, wind feeling for the pockets where choice still lived. Evan counted his blueberries again. Ella lined a toast soldiers in a neat row and ate them head first. "Pinch," she said, and turned back to the stove, but the corner of her mouth had learned a new softness. On the way to the study, Evan tugged Grace's sleeve. "If we laugh too loud, does it bother the house?" "House has heard louder," Grace said. "It used to host music." "And you know?" Ella asked, half skeptical, half hopeful. Grace tilted her head toward the dust-draped piano room. "Pianos don't grow under covers. Somebody loved sound here." They were quiet for a few steps, as if listening for old echoes. Then, in the study, numbers returned. The tutor drilled sums. Evan's foot kept a secret rhythm under the desk. Ella's eyes drifted to the window and back, guilt and desire trading places on her face. When the tutor called a break, they hovered near Grace like birds at a safe branch. "Do you forget people?" Ella asked suddenly, not looking at her. "Depends," Grace said. "Some people teach you a shape you keep." "What if a shape hurts?" Evan asked, the words small but aimed true. "Then you grow around it," Grace answered, "like a tree around a nail. It still exists, but the tree is larger." They considered that in serious silence. The tutor returned. The hour moved forward. At noon, Mrs. Porter granted the promised herbs. Ella pinched with reverence, Evan pinched too much, and sneezed basil dust like confetti. Instead of a scold, Grace handed him a towel and said, "Your sneeze has good aim." He grinned, wiping the counter with exaggerated care. The butler passed the doorway, took in the scene, and continued on with the faintest lift of an eyebrow that could have meant any number of things. Afternoon recreation, according to the binder, meant puzzles at the drawing room table. Grace brought the box and a roll of butcher paper. "First we draw what the finished picture should feel like," she said. "Then we build it." "You can draw a feeling?" Evan asked. "You just did," Grace said, pointing to the tiny crease between his brows. "Concentration." He smoothed the spot with 2 fingers, embarrassed, then laughed. Ella drew a zigzag she named, "I want the blue piece." While they worked, Grace slipped a small tin of finger paints from her bag. "Kitchen later," she whispered. "Aprons. We'll keep the mess where messes belong." Finger painting in the kitchen became an exercise in rules and mercy. Aprons tied, sleeves rolled, a sheet of plastic taped to the table with military precision. Then color, sun-warm yellow, sky blue, leaf green, poured out like permission. Evan smashed his palms into the paint and lifted them with awe, his hands transformed into living stamps. Ella pressed her fingertips, one by one, making constellations on paper. Mrs. Porter stood with a dish towel over one shoulder, watching, as if from a doorway of time. "If you track that down the hall, I'll tell him you tracked it down the hall," she warned, but her voice lacked teeth. Grace positioned a wet towel like a doormat and turned cleanup into a game. Every color that reached the cloth earned a point. They learned fast. When nap quiet arrived, Grace opened the binder again and found the passage about affection. She read it once, then twice, only to soothe injury or distress. She looked toward the children's rooms where two small shapes rested, then toward the ceiling, which had learned to keep every secret it was given. In the evening she followed the rule's words and not its spirit, waiting, as last night, in the hallway, with her hands making stories on the wall. Ella asked for a hug after a bad dream. Evan asked for a just-in-case hug because the dream might come later. Grace gave both, steady and brief, a shelter and not a camp. By midweek, she had mapped the house's tolerances. Lessons could absorb a joke at the half hour. Mrs. Porter would allow cinnamon on toast if the grains were counted as math. The butler approved any request framed as preparing the children for future social demands. Grace asked, politely, for use of the playroom. She waited and then Nicholas's afternoon meeting ran long. The driveway emptied, the garden brightened. Grace produced chalk from her bag like a magician would produce a dove. "Terrace only," she said. "Shoes on. Chalk wipes, clean. We will make a path that teaches feet to think." They drew hopscotch boxes with numbers that sometimes forgot the order on purpose. Evan leapt 1, 2, 4 with theatrical outrage. Ella invented a rule where you had to land like a cat. Grace added a square labeled breathe and made them stand in it for 3 counts before any brave jump. The chalk dust powdered their knees like a blessing. They were mid-game when the study curtains trembled. Grace glanced up and saw him, Nicholas, standing just out of sight behind the glass, watching. Not a glare, not a frown, a stillness. He saw his children airborne, not falling. He saw chalk on their shins, not danger. He saw Grace, feet bare now because she'd given her flags to Ella when a pebble worked into the child's shoe. He didn't move. The twins. Grace held his gaze through the glass for a heartbeat, then looked back to the squares and called out, "Cat landing!" They leapt. When she looked up again, the curtain had stilled. He was gone. Inside, the clock chimed. They scrubbed the chalk away with wet cloths until the stones shone, as if no one had ever laughed there. Grace liked the trace left behind, faint as memory. The house, she thought, was learning to hold both, the polished and the smudge. But that evening at dinner, the report from the tutor included a new word, engaged. Nicholas read it without comment, but his eyes lingered on the line, the way fingers linger on a warm mug when it's cold outside. The twins sat taller. Ella tucked her napkin as if folding away a secret triumph. Evan asked if basil was a leaf or a flavor. Nicholas answered both and seemed surprised when the word felt true. After the meal, as Grace guided the twins toward upstairs teeth in pajamas, Evan paused at the bottom step. "Are hugs against the rules if they're for good news?" "What's the good news?" Grace asked. "I liked math today," he admitted, almost sheepish. "I deserved a high five that got lost and turned into a hug," she said, "and made it so." Ella demanded equality. They went up grinning, rules intact, hearts fed. On Thursday, a rain threatened, then changed its mind. Nicholas left for a late appointment. Grace took the twins on a listening walk through the gallery instead of the garden, naming the sounds the house made when it thought no one was listening. The click of the cooling radiators, the whisper of the curtain cord, the soft thud of their own feet trusting the carpet. They ended at the closed. Grace pressed her ear to it and said, "I hear it, remembering us." Ella pressed her ear too and whispered, "It wants windows open." Evan tried and announced, "It wants dragons." Grace promised both one day. Friday brought a new test from the twins, delivered with the careful casualness of spies. "Will you still be here next Friday?" Ella asked, tracing a circle on the table with one finger. "Plan to be," Grace said. 25 months ago," Evan asked, "but you feel?" "Yes." "Then we keep showing yes until no grows curious," Grace answered. They accepted this like a riddle solved. After lessons, while Mrs. Porter measured flour for a cake that smelled like memory, Grace set 3 small bowls on the counter. Flour, water, salt. "Cloud dough," she explained. "It feels like sand that forgot the beach." With sleeves rolled, Mrs. Porter's nod earned in advance. They mixed, giggled at the sticky stage, and kneaded until the dough gathered itself. They formed tiny moons and a lopsided star. Grace pressed a thimble to make craters. Ella made a heart without being asked. Evan made a creature with too many legs and declared it a house guardian. They were wiping hands when footsteps approached. This time, Nicholas didn't pause at the threshold. He stepped into the kitchen, took in the bowls, the flour on noses, the dough moons lined like quiet planets. His gaze flicked to the towel under the stools, the clean edge of the counter, the order inside the experiment. He looked at Grace. "Me," he said, but his voice carried no judgment, only observation. "Caned," she answered. He nodded once, a verdict reached, and touched 2 fingers to one of the tiny moons as if testing its gravity. The twins watched him with open faces. He seemed about to say more, then changed his mind. "Carry on," he said, and left the scent of cake and salt behind him. That night, after shadow kites and sleepy breaths, Grace stood for a long moment in the dark hallway. The house had learned her steps, she had learned its hesitations. In her pocket, a square of twine waited for the next dry day. On the counter downstairs, the binder lay open to a page whose edges were beginning to curl. She smoothed it with her palm and whispered, "Important part," again, as if the words themselves could widen a doorway. In his study, Nicholas reviewed the week's notes. Tutors wrote, "Engaged, collaborative, volunteered answers." Mrs. Porter wrote, "Ate well, tried new things." The butler's line was brief, routine maintained, morale improved. Nicholas set down his pen and sat very still. Routine maintained, he thought, and yet something else had been allowed in. The sound of small joy, the chalk-dusted laugh, the careful mess with a clean border. He closed the folder, stared at the dark window, and saw, faintly, 3 figures on a terrace, hopping between invisible squares. He did not smile, exactly, but his jaw unclenched, and he let the image stay. It started with a simple accident. The twins had been sitting at the kitchen table, coloring while Grace sliced apples for their snack. A jug of cranberry juice sat between them, the kind Mrs. Porter favored for its health benefits and refined taste. Evan reached for a crayon, his elbow brushing the jug just enough to tip it sideways. The dark red waves spilled instantly, splashing across the table and down their laps. Ella gasped, jerking back, but the juice had already soaked into her dress. Evan's voice was small, guilt-heavy in the syllables. Grace grabbed a cloth, bloating hastily quickly. "It's all right. Accidents happen." She looked at their sticky clothes and shook her head with a gentle sigh. "We need to get you cleaned up before you turn into walking juice boxes." Normally, a mishap like this would mean a quick trip to the upstairs bathroom. But as they reached the landing, Grace twisted the tap on the large bathtub and frowned. The water ran icy cold. She tried the other taps, nothing but a chill that made her pull her fingers back. "Pipe's acting up again," Mrs. Porter called from down the hall. "Hot water tank's gone out. Repairman can't come till morning." Grace bit her lip, glancing at the twins. Both stood there, damp and uncomfortable, the cranberry stain clinging to their clothes and skin. "We can't wait till morning," she murmured. She thought for a moment, then remembered something she'd seen behind the potting shed on her first day. "Come on," she said with sudden decisiveness, leading them down the back stairs. They trailed behind, curious, until she pushed open the garden door and stepped into the sunlight. She crossed the lawn toward the far corner, where the stone wall met a small shed. There, leaning against the wall, was an old wooden barrel. What happened here was nobody's business, but we've got in touch and want to help support the gardeners. "What's that for?" Evan asked, peering inside. "Today," Grace said, testing the wood for sturdiness, "it's going to be a bath." The twins' eyes widened. "Outside?" Ella's voice was equal parts shock and excitement. "Outside," Grace confirmed, "in the sunshine. But first, hot water?" She marched them back into the kitchen and set 2 large kettles on the stove, then filled several pitchers with water from the cold tap. "We'll mix them so it's just warm enough, like a giant teacup but for people." Evan giggled at the idea. Ella began carrying small items outside without being asked. Towels, a bar of soap, and a jug of Mrs. Porter reluctantly surrendered, after Grace's quick explanation. Soon, the kettles whistled. Grace poured them carefully into the barrel, then topped it up with cold water until she was satisfied with the temperature. She rolled up her sleeves, feeling the steam against her skin. "All right," she said, "shoes off, clothes to the side, and in you go." They hesitated for just a heartbeat, then clambered in, gasping at the warmth. The water swashed over their knees, glittering in the sunlight. Grace knelt beside the barrel, dipping a small cup to pour water over their heads. The first rinse sent Ella into giggles. Evan splashed back, sending drops over the rim. "This is like a pirate bath," Evan declared, making a wave with his hands. "Then you must be Captain Evan," Grace said, playing along. "And you," she poured another cup gently over Ella's hair, "our first mate, Ella." They laughed louder, the kind of laughter that carried into the air and seemed to loosen something in the garden itself. Grace worked the soap into their hair, careful to shield their eyes, then let them take turns washing the deck, which was really just splashing water against the wooden sides. Birdsong joined their laughter. The afternoon light filtered through the high branches, scattering gold across the water's surface. Grace found herself smiling so much, her cheeks ached. It wasn't just that they were having fun, it was that they looked free. Evan tilted his head back, hair slicked to his forehead, eyes bright. "Best bath ever," he announced. "Even better than the bathtub with bubbles?" Grace teased. "Better," he said without hesitation. "Bubbles don't have sunshine." Ella nodded in solemn agreement. "And bubbles can't see the sky." Grace's heart tightened at the poetry of that, though she said nothing. She only reached for the pitcher again, pouring warm water over their shoulders as they leaned into it like kittens under a stream. What none of them noticed was the tall figure at the far edge of the garden, just beyond the hedgerow. Nicholas Ashford had come home earlier than expected. A meeting had been cancelled, and for once he'd felt no urge to fill the gap with another. He'd walked through the house, intending to head to his study, when he heard something unusual drifting through the open back door. Laughter, high, bright, unstrained. He followed it without thinking, his polished shoes soundless on the grass. Rounding the hedge, he stopped. There, in the middle of the sunlit garden, was the old rain barrel. He hadn't seen it used in years, and in it, his children. Evan and Ella were knee-deep in water, hair wet, faces lit with pure joy. Grace knelt beside them, sleeves rolled, her hands gentle and sure, as she rinsed soap from Ella's curls. For a moment, he simply stood, caught between disbelief and something heavier. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard them laugh like that. Real laughter, from the belly, the kind that comes when you forget to guard yourself. The sight struck him harder than he expected. Grace glanced up, perhaps sensing eyes on her. Their gazes locked. She didn't look away immediately, but she didn't smile either. Not in the way one might for an employer. Her expression was open, steady, as though she had nothing to apologize for. He should have spoken, he thought later. Should have said something about propriety or the state of the children's clothes. But the words didn't come. All he could do was watch as Evan leaned forward to scoop water in his hands and pour it over Ella's head, her shriek dissolving into giggles. When Grace turned back to the twins, Nicholas found himself rooted to the spot. Something shifting in his chest with slow, deliberate force. She lifted Evan under the arms to rinse him one last time, the water catching the sun in small diamonds before falling back into the barrel. "All right, sailors," she said, "time to park the ship." They clambered out, wrapping themselves in the towels Ella had brought earlier. Grace rubbed their hair dry, murmuring something Nicholas couldn't quite hear. Whatever it was, made them both beam up at her, eyes bright, as though she'd given them more than warmth, something invisible but vital. Nicholas stepped back before they could see him. He returned to the house the way he had come, his expression unreadable even to himself. In the privacy of his study, he sat at his desk and stared at the paperwork he had planned to finish. Instead, his mind replayed the scene. The sunlight, the laughter, the way Grace had moved without hesitation, as if joy were as necessary as soap. He had built his home into a place of order after his wife's passing. Order had felt safe, predictable. But in that garden, for the first time in years, he'd seen something unpredictable that didn't threaten him. It unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. Downstairs, Grace had shepherded the twins back inside, dressed them in clean clothes, and set them at the table with mugs of warm milk. Evan was still grinning as he recounted the pirate bath in vivid detail to Mrs. Porter. Ella added that the water had smelled like sunshine, which made Grace laugh softly as she poured the milk. Mrs. Porter glanced at her with a look that held more than curiosity. "Not many people get those two laughing together," she said quietly. "Not since—" She trailed off, glancing toward the closed study door. Grace didn't press. She only smiled and said, "Maybe they just needed the right ship." Later that night, as the twins slept, Nicholas passed their door on his way to his own room. He paused, hearing the faint sigh of even breathing. For a fleeting moment he saw them in the barrel again, faces turned to the sun. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but he didn't enter. Instead, he walked on, the image staying with him, stubborn as a shadow. He told himself it was just an afternoon, a moment, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it had been something else entirely, the first crack in walls he had thought unbreakable. It started with a simple accident. The twins had been sitting at the kitchen table, coloring, while Grace sliced apples for their snack. A jug of cranberry juice sat between them, the kind Mrs. Porter favored for its health benefits and refined taste. Evan reached for a crayon, his elbow brushing the jug just enough to tip it sideways. The dark red waves spilled instantly, splashing across the table and down their laps. Ella gasped, jerking back, but the juice had already soaked into her dress. "Oh no!" Evan's voice was small, guilt-heavy in the syllables. Grace grabbed a cloth, blotting a couple of bath brim quickly. "It's all right. Accidents happen." She looked at their sticky clothes and shook her head with a gentle sigh. "We need to get you cleaned up before you turn into walking juice boxes." Normally, a mishap like this would mean a quick trip to the upstairs bathroom. But as they reached the landing, Grace twisted the tap on the large bathtub and frowned. The water ran icy cold. She tried the other taps, nothing but a chill that made her pull her fingers back. "Pipes acting up again," Mrs. Porter called from down the hall. "Hot water tank's gone out. Repairman can't come till morning." Grace bit her lips, glancing at the twins. Both stood there, damp and uncomfortable, the cranberry stain clinging to their clothes and skin. "We can't wait till morning," she murmured. She thought for a moment, then remembered something she'd seen behind the potting shed on her first day. "Come on," she said with sudden decisiveness, leading them down the back stairs. They trailed behind, curious, until she pushed open the garden door and stepped into the sunlight. She crossed the lawn toward the far corner, where the stone wall met a small shed. There, leaning against the wall, was an old wooden barrel. Wide and deep, the kind that might once have held rainwater for the gardeners. "What's that for?" Evan asked, peering inside. "Today," Grace said, testing the wood for sturdiness, "it's going to be a bath." The twins' eyes widened. "Outside?" Ella's voice was equal parts shock and excitement. "Outside," Grace confirmed, "in the sunshine. But first, hot water?" She marched them back into the kitchen and set 2 large kettles on the stove, then filled several pitchers with water from the cold tap. "We'll mix them so it's just warm enough, like a giant teacup but for people." Evan giggled at the idea. Ella began carrying small items outside without being asked. Towels, a bar of soap, and a jug of Mrs. Porter reluctantly surrendered after Grace's quick explanation. Soon, the kettles whistled. Grace poured them carefully into the barrel, then topped it up with cold water until she was satisfied with the temperature. She rolled up her sleeves, feeling the steam against her skin. "All right," she said. "Shoes off, clothes to the side, and in you go." They hesitated for just a heartbeat, then clambered in, gasping at the warmth. The water sloughed over their knees, glittering in the sunlight. Grace knelt beside the barrel, dipping a small cup to pour water over their heads. The first rinse sent Ella into giggles. Evan splashed back, sending drops over the rim. "It's like a pirate bath," Evan declared, making a wave with his hands. "Then you must be Captain Evan," Grace said, playing along. "And you," she poured another cup gently over Ella's hair, "are first mate Ella." They laughed louder, the kind of laughter that carried into the air and seemed to loosen something in the garden itself. Grace worked the soap into their hair, careful to shield their eyes, then let them take turns washing the deck, which was really just splashing water against the wooden sides. Birdsong joined their laughter. The afternoon light filtered through the high branches, scattering gold across the water's surface. Grace found herself smiling so much, her cheeks ached. It wasn't just that they were having fun, it was that they looked free. Evan tilted his head back, hair slicked to his forehead, eyes bright. "Best bath ever," he announced. "Even better than the bathtub with bubbles?" Grace teased. "Better," he said without hesitation. "Bubbles don't have sunshine." Ella nodded in solemn agreement. "And bubbles can't see the sky." Grace's heart tightened at the poetry of that, though she said nothing. She only reached for the pitcher again, pouring warm water over their shoulders as they leaned into it like kittens under a stream. What none of them noticed was the tall figure at the far edge of the garden, just beyond the hedgerow. Nicholas Ashford had come home earlier than expected. A meeting had been cancelled, and for once, he'd felt no urge to fill the gap with another. He'd walked through the house, intending to head to his study, when he heard something unusual drifting through the open back door. Laughter. High, bright, unstrained. He followed it without thinking, his polished shoes soundless on the grass. Rounding the hedge, he stopped. There, in the middle of the sunlit garden, was the old rain barrel. He hadn't seen it used in years, and in it, his children. Evan and Ella were knee-deep in water, hair wet, faces lit with pure joy. Grace knelt beside them, sleeves rolled, her hands gentle and sure as she rinsed soap from Ella's curls. For a moment, he simply stood, caught between disbelief and something heavier. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard them laugh like that. Real laughter, from the belly, the kind that comes when you forget to guard yourself. The sight struck him harder than he expected. Grace glanced up, perhaps sensing eyes on her. Their gazes locked. She didn't look away immediately, but she didn't smile either. Not in the way one might for an employer. Her expression was open, steady, as though she had nothing to apologize for. He should have spoken, he thought later. Should have said something about propriety or the state of the children's clothes, but the words didn't come. All he could do was watch as Evan leaned forward to scoop water in his hands and pour it over Ella's head, her shriek dissolving into giggles. When Grace turned back to the twins, Nicholas found himself rooted to the spot, something shifting in his chest with slow, deliberate force. She lifted Evan under the arms to rinse him one last time, the water catching the sun in small diamonds before falling back into the barrel. "All right, sailors," she said, "time to dock the ship." They clambered out, wrapping themselves in the towels Ella had brought earlier. Grace rubbed their hair dry, murmuring something Nicholas couldn't quite hear. Whatever it was made them both beam up at her, eyes bright, as though she'd given them more than warmth, something invisible but vital. Nicholas stepped back before they could see him. He returned to the house the way he had come, his expression unreadable even to himself. In the privacy of his study, he sat at his desk and stared at the paperwork he had planned to finish. Instead, his mind replayed the scene. The sunlight, the laughter, the way Grace had moved without hesitation, as if joy were as necessary as soap. He had built his home into a place of order after his wife's passing. Order had felt safe, predictable. But in that garden, for the first time in years, he'd seen something unpredictable that didn't threaten him. It unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. Upstairs, Grace had shepherded the twins back inside, dressed them in clean clothes, and set them at the table with mugs of warm milk. Evan was still grinning as he recounted the pirate bath in vivid detail to Mrs. Porter. Ella added that the water had smelled like sunshine, which made Grace laugh softly as she poured the milk. Freeborn glanced at her with a look that held more than curiosity. "Not many people get to those two laughing together," she said quietly. "Not since—" She trailed off, glancing toward the closed study door. Grace didn't press. She only smiled and said, "Maybe they just needed the right ship." Later that night, as the twins slept, Nicholas passed their door on his way to his own room. He paused, hearing the faint sigh of even breathing. For a fleeting moment, he saw them in the barrel again, faces turned to the sun. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but he didn't enter. Instead, he walked on, the image staying with him stubborn as a shadow. He told himself it was just an afternoon. A moment, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it had been something else entirely. The first crack in walls he had thought unbreakable. The invitation arrived not as a card or a formal summons, but as a quiet knock on the nursery door just before 6. The butler stood there, hands folded, voice even. "Mr. Ashford requests your presence at dinner. With the children." Grace glanced up from buttoning Ella's cardigan. "Me?" "Yes, Miss Moreno." A measured pause. "This is unusual." Ella's face lit. "You're sitting with us." "Well, that's all right," Grace said, smoothing the tiny pearl buttons. Evan held out his sleeve for inspection and pretended to look bored, but his foot tapped a quick rhythm on the rug. They walked together toward the dining room, the twins flanking her, as if escorting a treaty. The long table had been replaced by a smaller, round one tonight, the chandelier dimmed to a soft glow that didn't make anyone squint. Mrs. Porter had set places for 4. Napkins were folded in simple fans instead of stiff birds. It felt less like ceremony, more like possibility. Nicholas rose when they entered. He wasn't in a suit. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled at once. The change was small, but disarming. "Thank you for joining us," he said, almost awkwardly to Grace. "Please, sit." They took their places, twins side by side, Grace to their left, Nicholas across. Soup came first, fragrant and warm. For a minute, there was only the clink of spoons and the faint hum of the chandelier. Then, Ella burst. "We took a bath in a barrel." The butler almost dropped a water glass. Nicholas's spoon paused mid-air. Grace braced, but she kept her gaze steady. "Barrel?" Nicholas repeated, as if testing whether the word could be true and harmless at the same time. "It was the best bath," Evan said, not looking at his father, as if the bath might be taken back. "Warm like tea. The sky was the ceiling." "The birds were the music," Ella added, cheeks flushed just from remembering. "And the water made little diamonds when it splashed." Nicholas's expression shifted, not to disapproval, but to something gentler. He set his spoon down. "Diamonds?" "Thousands," she said, hands describing falling light. "Maybe 1,000,000. Grace waited for the verdict, calm on the outside and taut inside. Nicholas glanced at her, and there it was again, that brief, unguarded warmth she'd seen in the garden. "Did you two enjoy it?" he asked the twin. Evan nodded, finally daring to meet his father's eyes. "We laughed," he admitted, like confessing to treasure. 4 years ago. "Laughter is good," Nicholas said quietly. Then, almost wryly, "And no one turned into a cranberry." The children giggled. Grace felt a smile she hadn't planned rise to her mouth and let it stay. Mrs. Porter arrived with roasted chicken and green beans that still had a snap to them. Conversation loosened a notch. Evan explained a new game he and Grace had invented for math. Ella announced she had named the kitchen shadow that looks like a Katniss. Cinnamon listened, chiming in with questions that didn't lead the children like a leash, only widened their path. When dessert came, lemon tart with a thin curl of rind, Nicholas tried to cut the children's slices smaller. Ella, brave with sugar near, asked, "If we eat the crust, does that make us efficient?" "It makes you thorough," he said, and surprised himself by laughing when she used the lemon wedge like a smile. He was different tonight, Grace realized. Not less careful exactly, but less armored. He asked for secondhand stories of their day and didn't flinch when the answers were messy. He even told one small tale of his own, about a summer when he was 8 and tried to build a raft with planks that refused to agree about floating. The twins watched him as if he had just opened a door they didn't know existed. Grace watched too and, for a moment, let her guard slip. Here was a man who remembered being a boy. Here was a father leaning toward the sound of his children instead of away. After dessert, the twins carried their plates to the sideboard on tiptoe and returned to the table, elbows off, without being reminded. They looked so pleased to be pleasing that Grace felt a tug in her chest, equal parts joy and ache. She wanted this to be ordinary for them. She wanted this to be frequent enough to forget to count. Nicholas rested his forearms on the table, hands folded, eyes on the twins. "Thank you for telling me about your barrel bath," he said. "It sounds like a day worth keeping." "It's already kept," Evan said, tapping his chest. "In here." Ella tapped too, not her chest but Grace's hand. "And here?" That touch, small and certain, made Grace feel suddenly too visible. She squeezed Ella's fingers, then let go. "Bedtime," she said gently, rising. "Teeth, pajamas, and one shadow story, if you're quick." "Two," Evan bargained, mouth lemon sweet. "Who and a half," Grace countered. Nicholas stood too. "One and a bonus joke," he said, glancing at Grace as if testing whether he had permission to enter their ritual. The twins gasped, victorious. Grace nodded once, surprised into a soft laugh. Together, they left the dining room, the butler clearing plates with a face that had learned how not to smile and was losing the battle. Upstairs, the routine threaded itself through warm baths and soft towels. Inside ones this time, and the familiar choreography of small bodies getting sleep-ready. Nicholas lingered in the doorway while Grace made a rabbit and a kite on the wall. When she finished, he offered a very old, very silly joke about a piano that went to the doctor because it had too many keys. The twins groaned like connoisseurs of terrible humor. Nicholas looked at Grace as if to apologize for the joke's quality. She shook her head. It had been perfect. When the children finally settled, Nicholas stepped back into the hall. "For today," Grace met his eyes. "They make it easy," she said. It was true, and not enough. She wanted to say, "You do too, when you let yourself." Instead, she smiled and turned toward the stairs. She needed air. She needed distance to file the evening properly inside herself. He stayed where he was, watching the shadow of her steps slip along the banister like a ribbon. Stairs, the house softened into post-dinner quiet. Grace stopped by the kitchen to thank Mrs. Porter for the tart, and then headed toward the side corridor that led to her room. As she passed the smaller sitting room, she heard voices, Nicholas and the butler, low and unhurried. She wouldn't have listened if her name hadn't formed the first clear word she caught. "Miss Moreno is different," Nicholas said. The butler's answer was a murmur she couldn't make out. Grace froze where the corridor met the dark edge of the sitting room, unseen. "She has good instincts," Nicholas continued. "The children respond to her. The house feels—" He searched and let the sentence thin out. "But I can't allow them to get too attached." "Sir," the butler said softly, respectful but firm, "attachment is not a fire." "It burns when it's gone," Nicholas said, and the simplicity of his answer made the room tilt for Grace, as if gravity had changed corridors. "I won't put them through that again. Or myself." The butler's reply was thoughtful, and yet they are already attached. A pause. She felt it in the air, a held breath. "Then we keep boundaries," Nicholas said at last, the decision settling like a stone in a bowl. "Clear ones. We don't confuse the role." Footsteps shifted. Grace stepped backward, quiet as a closing book, and continued to her room without being seen. Behind her ribs, something went still, then hardened. "Different," he had said, as though she were a useful instrument, not a person who inhabited the same air his children breathed. As though the laughter in the garden had been an exception he needed to quarantine. As though love were a mistake, not a muscle. She sat on the edge of the bed and unpinned her hair, fingers steady by choice. She would not cry over a conversation she was never meant to hear. She would not surrender the day to a sentence. She would, instead, make a decision of her own. Starting tomorrow, she would be immaculate, with boundaries, duties precise, reports crisp, smiles for the twins, yes unfailing, unwavering. But with Nicholas she would build a clean line and stay on her side. No lingering at doorways, no trading small smiles over bad jokes, no catching of eyes across a table that had felt briefly like a wrap. The twins needed her strongest. She could not be a wish in a house that feared wishes. She folded the day into its place, turned off the lamp, and lay down. Sleep took its time. When it came, it moved like a tide that had learned the shore by heart. Morning arrived, dressed in quiet. Grace was in the kitchen, before the children, tying aprons, setting out small bowls of berries, and writing 2 simple notes on slips of paper she slid beneath their cups. Evans read, "You notice patterns. That is a superpower." Ella's, "Your laughter makes room." When the twins clattered in, She greeted them with the practiced warmth that had always been honest with them, and kept it trained like a lantern. Evan found his note and blushed. Ella pressed hers to her chest as if checking its heartbeat. They did not feel the shift in Grace. It was not for them. Nicholas entered a few minutes later. He looked more formal than the night before, the morning's armor restored. Grace said, "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," with professional ease and a polite smile that reached no further than the edge of respect. He noticed she saw him notice, but he only nodded and asked the twins about their plans. They told him about cloud dough and an alphabet scavenger hunt. He approved the scavenger hunt and asked that they keep the kitchen clear during certain hours. Grace wrote the note down and underlined it. She had no intention of leaving room for critique today. Lessons flowed. Grace sat where the tutor wanted her, offered help only when asked, and turned the half-hour break into a quiet drawing time without jokes. The twins still gravitated toward her, of course. Attachment, she thought, was already in the foundation. It didn't need permission. But she guided their lean back toward tasks with a feather-light hand. She did not meet Nicholas's eyes when he passed the doorway. At lunch, Ella asked for basil again and looked to Grace, who glanced to Mrs. Porter and then to Nicholas. "May we?" "Yes," he said, surprised at his own answer. Ella pinched exactly enough, delighted at the trust. Grace thanked him neutrally and helped Ella wipe the counter. The word "thank you" landed like a card placed perfectly in a stack. Neither invitation nor rebuke, only procedure. In the early afternoon, the sky turned the color of pewter. Rain tapped at the high windows. The twins grew restless, then droopy. "Reading," the tutor announced, and set them to it. Grace sat with Ella and traced along the words only when the girl's attention drifted. Evan read his passage with focus and then whispered, "Will you be here for shadows tonight?" "I'll be in the hallway," Grace said, like always. He nodded, reassured. The steadiness of ritual did its work. After lessons, Grace steered recreation to the drawing room, per the binder. She brought the box of blocks instead of the butcher paper, keeping mess contained to shapes that stacked and fell without leaving a mark. She avoided the terrace door, avoided the soft rebellion she and the twins had shared. No twine, no chalk. She could almost feel the house noticing, a small disappointment in the floorboards that wasn't hers to. Her Nicholas appeared in the doorway, hand in his pockets. "How is the scavenger hunt?" he asked the twins. "Found Q on the quilt," Evan reported, "and X on the xylophone." Grace rose and handed Nicholas the lift without stepping close. "We're on track," she said. He glanced at her, perhaps expecting the warmth from last night. She offered none. He studied her for a moment that lasted one heartbeat too long, and then nodded. "Very good," he said. "Carry on." She did. Through snack, through hand-washing, through the slow slope into evening. She moved with confidence so crisp it almost made a sound. The twins were content. They didn't miss the edges she'd sanded down, or if they did, their contentment swallowed the question before it formed. Dew was quieter than the night before, though not unfriendly. The round table remained, a remnant of warmth, but the conversation skirted safer banks. The barrel bath became a story the children told once, then let set. Nicholas listened. He laughed once, softly, at something Evan said about the kitchen cat shadow insisting on extra crumbs. Grace smiled because the children were watching. She did not let her smile linger when Nicholas looked up. The butler poured water and, for the first time, looked at Grace as if he could tell she had stepped back from a line no one else could see. Upstairs, the shadow stories flapped across the wall. The rabbit, the kite, the two small figures who always stood together. When the children's breathing settled into sleep, Grace rose, smoothed their blankets, and stepped into the hall. Nicholas stood there, hands in his pockets, as if he had been deciding whether to knock. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward Evan's doorway. She stepped aside. He looked in for a long moment, the kind of look that fathers take when they remember that time moves whether or not they are watching. "Thank you," he said, backing away, his voice quiet enough to be a thought. "For yesterday and today." "You're welcome," she answered, tone even. She added nothing. She did not ask him to walk downstairs with her. She did not offer the softness he had almost reached for last night. He hesitated, then said, "If there's anything you need for the children's program tomorrow, "I'll send a list through the butler," she said. Polite, efficient, correct. His mouth moved as if around a word he did not choose. "Very well." They parted on the landing. He went toward his study, she went toward her room. In her chest, a spare ache took up its quiet, disciplined position. That night, rain found its confidence and threaded itself through the ivy outside her window. Grace lay awake long enough to decide 3 things. First, the twins would not pay for adult mistakes with confusion. She would be their constant. Second, she would not risk the fragile good thing growing in them by leaning into something Nicholas could not name. Third, if there was a future in this house where walls softened into doors, it would come because of the children, not because she knocked. In his study, Nicholas sat very still in the chair he used when memory was either too heavy or too light. The image of the barrel held, the sound of his children's laughter held, the shape of Grace's careful distance held too, a cool perimeter he felt more keenly than he expected. He told himself it was wise. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he preferred order to longing. But when the house finally slept and the rain unwound into a hush, he admitted something to the dark he could not yet say to daylight. He missed the way the garden felt with 4 people in it. He missed the way his children had run their words, through Grace first, not because they feared him, but because they trusted her to make their joy solid. He closed his eyes and let the admission be what it was: private, unbrave, real. Tomorrow he would be who he had decided to be. Tonight, he let himself remember sunlight on water and the sound of diamonds falling. The house felt different the next morning. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that hummed beneath the skin like the air before a storm. Grace moved through her duties without a word to Nicholas, without lingering glances in the halls or half-smiles at the breakfast table. The twins sensed it too. Evan's usual chatter was subdued, and Ella, her ankle propped on a cushion, kept stealing worried looks between her nanny and her father. After helping Ella into the sitting room, Grace excused herself to put away the fresh laundry. The corridor leading to the west wing was lined with closed doors, most of them rooms she had never been invited to enter. But halfway down, one stood ajar. She wasn't sure what made her pause: curiosity, instinct, or the faint scent of cedar that drifted through the opening. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through heavy drapes. It was a study, though the dust along the edges of the desk suggested it hadn't been used in months. Grace meant to step back, to leave. But then her eyes caught on an envelope lying atop a stack of leather-bound books. It wasn't sealed, and the handwriting on it was delicate, looping, feminine. The kind of script that came from someone who still wrote letters by hand because the words felt truer that way. Grace told herself she shouldn't. It wasn't hers. But the name at the top and the faint smear of ink along the edge kept her rooted to the spot. She reached for it almost without thinking, unfolding the paper inside. The first line made her breath catch. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back." She didn't know why her hands trembled. The letter went on in a voice so tender it almost hurt to read. It was from Clara Ashford, Nicola's late wife. The words painted a picture of a woman who loved her family fiercely but had known, even before the illness, that she might not have long. She spoke of the twins, how Evan would need someone to encourage his curiosity, how Ella would need someone to remind her she was. She spoke of Nicholas, too, and the fear she'd seen in him, the way he built walls to keep from losing more than he already had. The last paragraph was a plea. If you can, please help him see that love doesn't make the pain worse, it makes it worth it. Grace folded the letter carefully, her chest heavy. She understood now. Nicholas's rules, his sharp edges, his cold detachment, they weren't cruelty, they were armor. Armor forged in grief and worn so long he didn't know how to take it off. She didn't hear him until his shadow stretched across the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" Nicola's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the tension beneath it. Grace turned, holding the letter in both hands. "I didn't mean to pry. I found this." His gaze went to the envelope, and something flickered in his expression. Pain, yes, but also something harder. "Put it back." She hesitated. "Nicholas, she wanted you to—" "I said put it back." His tone sharpened, the wall between them slamming back into place. Grace did as he asked, returning the letter to its place on the desk. You're not honoring her by shutting everyone out. You're doing the opposite of what she wanted. His jaw tightened. You don't get to tell me how to honor my wife. I'm not, she said softly. She is. For a long moment, they stood there, neither moving. Then Nicholas stepped forward, his eyes locking on hers. Whatever you think you understand, Grace, you don't. That letter is all I have left of her. I can't. He broke off, shaking his head. I won't risk letting someone else in just to lose them too. Grace felt the ache of his words deep in her own ribs, but she didn't step back. You already let me in, Nicholas. You let me into their lives, and whether you like it or not, that means you've let me into yours. He stared at her, as if weighing something he couldn't quite name. Then he turned away, his voice low. Stay out of my study. She left without another word, but the weight of the letter stayed with her, each line etching itself into her memory. It was a truth she couldn't unlearn, and one she knew he would fight until he had no choice but to face it. That night, Grace found it impossible to sleep. The letter's words looped in her mind, not just the plea for love, but the descriptions of the twins, their strengths, their needs. Clara had known her children in a way only a mother could, and Grace could see that some of those needs were still unmet. When she checked on the twins before bed, Evan was curled at the foot of Ella's bed, holding her hand. Grace smiled faintly, adjusting the blanket over them both. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Nicholas. He looked as though he'd been walking without purpose, his hair slightly disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. Asleep? He asked. Evan's with her. Nicholas nodded once, his gaze shifting past her as if he didn't quite know how to meet her eyes. The doctor says the ankle will heal quickly. Good. He was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower. I know you think I'm overprotective. I know you are, Grace replied gently. And I also know why. His head came up at that, a flicker of defensiveness flashing through his expression. I read enough of that letter to understand, she said. She asked you to keep loving, not to stop because it hurt too much. Nicholas' eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, there was no anger, only exhaustion. You think it's that simple? Cried Grace, but I think the hardest things are usually the ones worth doing. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. You talk like you've never lost anything. Lost more than I'd like to admit, she said. And I learned that grief doesn't shrink when you lock it away. It just waits. And one day, when you least expect it, it breaks you. They stood there, the dim hallway light spilling between them. Then Nicholas stepped back. Good night, Grace. She nodded, but as she walked away, she knew this conversation wasn't over. Not because she needed it to be, but because, deep down, he did. In her room, Grace sat by the window, looking out over the garden. Somewhere in that house was a man still in love with the memory of his wife, and somewhere in that same house was a letter asking him to find the courage to love again. She didn't know if Nicholas Ashford would ever let himself do that. But she knew she wouldn't stop trying to help him see what Clara had already known, that love, no matter how much it could hurt, was worth every moment it gave. The late afternoon sun poured over the garden in a warm golden haze, spilling across the lawn and catching on the edges of the old wooden barrel that now sat near the edge of the path. Grace ran her hand over its rim, the memory of the twins' laughter from that day still vivid in her mind. This time, though, the barrel had a different purpose. Ella stood a few feet away, her small fingers gripping Grace's hands. The little girl's ankle had healed enough for walking, but she was still hesitant, the fear of another fall lingering in her eyes. Evan stood nearby, bouncing on his toes, as if ready to cheer at a moment's notice. Do you see that barrel? Grace asked softly, crouching to meet Ella's gaze. That's our finish line. You don't have to run, you just take one step at a time. I'll be right here. Ella bit her lip but nodded, her tiny fingers tightened in Grace's grip. Ready? They took the first step together, slow and deliberate. The grass crunched lightly underfoot. Ella's face was tense at first, but Grace kept smiling, murmuring little encouragements. Good, that's perfect. just like that. Halfway there, a voice joined them, low, steady, and unexpectedly warm. "You're doing great," Ella, Nicholas said. Grace glanced up in surprise. He was standing on the other side of the barrel, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, and for once, there was no guarded distance, only quiet. Ella's steps grew steadier as she moved toward him. Evan darted ahead to stand beside his father, clapping wildly. "Come on, Ella. You're almost there." Grace loosened her hold, letting Ella take the last few steps on her own. The little girl's determination shone through, her small frame leaning forward as though pulled by the strength of her father's voice. And then she reached the barrel, pausing just long enough to grin before stumbling the final distance into Nicholas's waiting arms. He caught her easily, lifting her up and spinning her once before hugging her close. "That's my brave girl," he murmured. Evan jumped in, laughing, and Nicholas pulled him into the embrace too. Grace stood a few steps back, watching the three of them, father, son, and daughter, fold into each other in a way that felt almost fragile in its beauty. Nicholas looked up then, his gaze meeting Grace's across the barrel. For a moment, no words were necessary. She could see it in his eyes, the acknowledgement, the gratitude, the shift he had been resisting for so long. He lowered Ella and Evan to the ground, letting them run off to the swing set. Then he stepped toward Grace, his voice quieter than before. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. "For giving them something I didn't think they could have again," he said. "For giving me something I didn't think I could have again." The sincerity in his tone left her momentarily speechless. She only nodded, the faintest smile touching her lips as the twins' laughter rang out behind them. The day might have ended there, but the way Nicholas lingered, as if reluctant to let the moment fade, told her this was only the beginning of something neither of them had quite dared to imagine. That evening, the house felt different. The formal distance that usually clung to every corridor seemed to have loosened, as if the laughter from the garden had threaded itself into the walls. Grace was in the kitchen, helping the cook put away the last of the dishes, when Nicholas appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, watching her. "Did you need something?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "You," he said after a pause. "You. In the study." Her brows lifted in surprise, but she followed him. The study was warmer than usual, the fire already lit. Nicholas closed the door behind them, moving to stand by the hearth. "I haven't felt alive in a long time," he began, his voice low and steady. "Since Clara died, every day has been about keeping things together, making sure the children were safe, making sure I didn't break." Grace stood quietly, letting him speak. "I thought if I kept the world at a distance, if I kept people at a distance, I could protect them and myself. But all I did was turn this house into a shell. And today," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly, "today, I saw them run toward me, laughing. I saw Ella's courage, Evan's joy. I saw her in them again. And I realized," Ferris's throat tightened, "it wasn't just me. They're still your children. You're the reason they—" He stepped closer, his expression open in a way she had never seen before. "Maybe, but you reminded me how, and I don't know how to thank you for that." "You just did," she said softly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the fire crackling between them. Then Nicholas exhaled, almost a laugh, but one tinged with disbelief. "Grace, I don't know where this is going, but I do know I don't want to go back to the way things were." Her heart caught on the words, but before she could answer, the sound of small footsteps echoed in the hall. Evan and Ella appeared in the doorway, their eyes bright. "Papa, can we say goodnight to Grace?" Evan asked. Nicholas glanced at her, then nodded. The twins crossed the room, each giving her a hug, their warmth lingering long after they left. When the door closed again, Nicholas's gaze returned to her. "You see, they've already chosen you." Grace smiled faintly, though her heart was pounding. "Then, I'll do my best to be worthy of it." Nicholas nodded, but the softness in his expression said more than words could. And in that quiet, they both understood this wasn't just about the children anymore. Something had shifted between them, something fragile yet certain. It was a step neither had planned to take, but once taken, there was no going back. The air was crisp with the scent of early spring, the kind that carried both the memory of winter and the promise of warmer days. Rows of white chairs lined the freshly cut lawn, facing a small wooden stage draped in garlands of ivy and soft yellow flowers. Beyond it, children's laughter rang faintly from the newly built play area, where a ribbon of bright red cord marked the entrance. Grace stood near the edge of the stage, her hands smoothing the skirt of her pale blue dress, though her nerves had nothing to do with the fabric. A year ago, this place had been only an idea, one of Nicholas's late-night confessions, spoken in the quiet after the twins had gone to bed. Now it stood before her. The Ashford Outdoor Therapy Center, built in memory of Clara Ashford and dedicated to giving children a safe space to heal, grow, and play without fear. She caught sight of Nicholas a few feet away, speaking with the mayor. His suit was sharp, but there was a lightness in his posture she'd rarely seen before. The man who had once stood behind walls of grief now carried himself as someone who had found not only purpose, but peace. The crowd hushed as Nicholas stepped up to the podium, his deep voice carried across the lawn, steady but warm. When I first imagined this place, it was in honor of my late wife Clara. She believed every child deserved joy, no matter their circumstances. For a long time, I thought the best way to protect my own children was to shield them from the world. I was wrong. They needed laughter, friends, and the freedom to be themselves, and, as it turned out, I needed those. His eyes found Grace in the crowd for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before he continued. This center is for every child who needs a place to heal, a place to run, a place to remember that life can be good again. It is also for the people who helped them believe that. When the ribbon was finally cut, applause rippled through the crowd, and the twins came bounding up to the stage. Ella's hair was caught in a neat braid, while Evan had a small boutonniere pinned to his shirt. Each held one side of a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. "Papa," Ella said breathlessly, "we have something for you, and for Grace." They placed the package on a small table. Nicholas gestured for Grace to join him, and together they peeled away the paper. Inside was a framed photograph, the four of them in the garden beside the old barrel. The sunlight had caught them mid laughter, Ella perched on the rim, Evan splashing water, Nicholas with his arms around both children, and Grace smiling beside them. Beneath the photograph, engraved into the frame, were the words, "Some laughter never fades." Grace's throat tightened as she glanced at the twins. "When did you—" "We asked Mr. Thompson to take it last summer," Evan said proudly. "We wanted you to have it today." Nicholas' hand found hers, warm and steady. "It's perfect," he said softly, though his voice was thick with emotion. Ella and Evan wrapped their arms around both of them, the four of them fitting together with the ease of something long overdue. Grace leaned into the embrace, feeling the steady beat of Nicholas's heart against her shoulder. The day had begun as a dedication to the memory of someone lost. But as she looked around, at the children running across the grass, at Nicholas's unguarded smile, at the twins holding on to them both, Grace knew this day was just as much about what had been found. The crowd eventually drifted toward the refreshments, but Nicholas and Grace lingered near the stage with the twins. The framed photograph remained on the table, drawing curious glances from passers-by who smiled at the image before moving on. "Between now and then," Nicholas said quietly, "a year ago, I couldn't have imagined this. Not just the center, but us." Grace glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Neither could I, and yet here we are." The twins darted off toward the new climbing frame, Evan calling over his shoulder that he'd race Ella to the top. Grace watched them go, her smile deepening. "They've changed so much," she said. "They're braver now, happier." "She've had the right person showing them how," Nicholas replied, his tone leaving no doubt about who he meant. Grace looked away, heat rising to her cheeks. "It wasn't just me, Nicholas. You've changed too. They see that." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for her hand again, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "I spent years thinking love was something I'd already used up, that what I had with Clara was all there would ever be. But then, you came here, stubborn, fearless, and far too willing to break my rules. And you brought this house back to life. You brought me back to life. Grace's breath caught. You didn't make it easy. No, he admitted, a faint smile touching his lips. But you stayed anyway. And I'm grateful every day that you did. The moment stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of the twins' laughter and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Nicholas finally spoke again, his voice lower now. Grace, I don't want us to keep thinking of this as a job you stayed for. I want it to be something we choose, all of us. Her heart thudded in her chest. What are you saying? For a moment, he said, his eyes steady on hers, that I don't just see you as the person who saved my children. I see you as part of our family, and I want you to stay. Not because of them, not because of obligation, but because you want this too. Grace felt the sting of tears as she realized the truth. She had already made her choice months ago. I do, she said simply. Nicholas' hand tightened around hers. The twins came running back then, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. Come see the treehouse, Evan urged. In it, he said. He crouched down to their level. You two know that Grace is more than just your nanny, right? Ella nodded solemnly. She's ours. Nicholas' smile widened. Exactly, she's ours. Grace knelt beside them, the four of them forming a small circle. And you two are mine, she said softly. They walked together toward the play area, the sunlight warm on their backs. The framed photograph remained on the table behind them, but Grace knew its words were true. Some laughter never fades. As Nicholas's arm brushed hers and the twins ran ahead, she understood that this, the barrel, the garden, the shared smiles and tears, was no longer about where they had been. It was about where they were going. And they would be going there together.